To the Bible study at the First United Methodist Church of Temple. I'm Tom Robbins. It is a privilege to have you with us today. Chris and Emily Lincoln are the ones doing all the tech aspect of this Bible study, and I'm very appreciative they're here. We're going to be working today with the book of Acts. Now, remember what Acts actually is. It is one of two letters written by Luke. He wrote the Gospel of Luke and also the book of Acts. They're both addressed to a Roman official named Theophilus. The Romans were trying to decide whether Christianity was actually a threat to their empire. And Luke begins by saying he sets out to write an orderly account. Now, the Gospel of Luke has to do with the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the good news. The book of Acts has to do with Christianity spreading across the Roman Empire, exactly how it happened. And the book of Acts in the New Testament actually is as close as we can find to a historical account. The epistles in Acts, all or most of them, relate back to the book of Acts because Paul, who wrote 13 letters in our New Testament, is one of the primary characters in the book of Acts. He was the greatest threat to Christianity as Saul. But then through a dramatic conversion process on the road to Damascus, where God literally strikes him blind, he realizes instead of doing God's will, he has been fighting against God. He converts to Christianity and he becomes the greatest missionary the church has ever seen. In Acts, what we see is Paul actually had 3 different missionary journeys. We're looking at close to the very conclusion of the 3rd journey. This is Acts chapter 20, and it's one of my favorite stories in the Bible, and when you hear the story, you'll understand why. We're going to start with Acts chapter 20, verse 7. On the first day of the week, when we met to break bread, Paul was holding a discussion with them since he intended to leave the next day. He continued speaking until midnight. There were many lamps in the room upstairs where we were meeting. A young man named Eutychus was sitting in the window. He began to sink off into a deep sleep while Paul talked still longer. Overcome by sleep, he fell to the ground 3 floors below and was picked up dead. But Paul went down and bending over him, took him in his arms and said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." Then Paul went upstairs, and after he had broken bread and eaten, he continued to converse with them until dawn. Then he left. Meanwhile, they had taken the boy away alive and were not a little comforted. And that's where we will end this morning's scripture reading. Now, what I like about this scripture reading is, in essence, Paul is preaching, and he goes on and on and on, and Eutychus falls asleep during the sermon, falls out the window, and dies. Now, the whole point of this story is, if you fall asleep in one of my sermons, you will die. It's going to happen. So don't do it. Not really. The point is simply this to this story. There are things that do actually get in the way of us hearing God. I have preached some sermons that could put somebody straight into a coma, so I'm guilty of doing that for people. But in looking at what gets in the way, especially during worship, when you come into worship, you bring with you all the concerns of the world, everything that you're dealing with. And right now, for many people, this is an incredibly difficult, uncomfortable time. Earlier this week, it was announced that Baylor Scott and White would lay off 1,200 employees. It's going to be a very difficult time for them, and we need to lift them up in prayer. We have now passed over 100,000 deaths just here in the United States from the coronavirus. It doesn't look like it's going to let up anytime soon. We're about to have another spike. People are worried about their finances. People are worried about their health. They're worried about the health of their loved ones. Some parents have been cooped up with their children long enough. The list goes on and on and on. There are a lot of distractions out there in the world right now. And when it comes to worship, many times these distractions have the potential to get in the way. Think about prayer itself. Have you ever been in prayer and suddenly you find yourself not at all concentrating on God or specific people that you're lifting up, but your mind just kind of drifts away to other concerns that you have? This happens to everyone. And if we're not careful, if we're not attentive, it happens even in the midst of worship. Now, Chris, what has gotten in the way of you hearing God during worship?
My own distractions.
Your own distractions?
Phones.
Yeah, Emily held up your cell phone right now.
Yeah, that's true.
Are you ever on your cell phone when I'm preaching?
Never.
Never. Okay, that's good.
It's never happened.
Okay. Emily, is that true?
Oh, Lord, no.
Okay, that's what I thought. So, not only falling asleep, but if you're on your cell phone during my sermon, you will die. Do not do that. But just think in these terms. There are things that actually do get in the way. There are times we have to focus. Focus is not easy. The more you work at it, the easier it becomes, much like meditation. If you've ever tried meditative prayer, at first it is incredibly difficult. It's strenuous. It'll wear you out. But the longer you do this, the easier it becomes. And eventually, meditative prayer is something that you would actually crave. The point is, we cannot let the distractions of the world in any way pull us away from facing the one that makes life beautiful. And that's God. In the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is mourning the loss of his relative John the Baptist. And this was a hard time for him. He wants to be alone. The crowds actually follow him. They're in the middle of nowhere. There are over 5,000 people with every sort of malady you can possibly imagine. And Jesus, even though he needs to grieve, he sets aside the time. He heals all of them. And once he has healed them, once he has fed them, he sends them away. And then he tells the disciples to get in a boat and go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and he will meet them there. And finally, he's alone. He has his chance to grieve and to mourn the loss of John the Baptist. After he is through with his prayer, he walks out onto the water on the Sea of Galilee towards the disciples who are in the midst of fighting for their lives in a terrible storm. And when they see Jesus, at first they think he's a ghost. They're panicked. They scream in terror. And Jesus identifies himself. And Peter says, "Lord, if it is you, command me to walk to you on the water." And listen to what the Bible says. He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And the Bible says this: Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt?" Now, the crux of this story revolves not around the fact that Peter is actually walking on top of the water, this miracle that Jesus has enabled to happen. The crux of the story revolves around the fact that as Peter is in the midst of this miracle, he is distracted. He looks away from the one that grants life and light. He notices the wind. And when he does, he begins to sink. This is what happens to all of us when we look in the wrong direction. Now, again, don't get me wrong, the distractions of this world are real and the concerns are many. But never let that interfere or override your focus on Jesus Christ. Everything for us revolves around Jesus. If you ever look at the Gospel of John, you see right off the bat that how the Gospel of John is portrayed, and understand that each gospel has a different author, different theme and is addressed to a different group, even though they all are about Jesus Christ. Matthew, written by a tax collector, is trying to convince Jews that Jesus is the Messiah, and he came not just for the good people, but also for the bad. Then you've got Mark. Mark would best be understood as the newspaper account of the gospel. It just gives you the facts. There's no birth narrative there. It just begins with John the Baptist marching out of the desert saying, "Get ready, here he comes." You can read Mark in one sitting. Then comes Luke, and I talked about Luke earlier today. Luke was written to a man named Theophilus, and he is trying to explain exactly what Christianity is and also what Christianity is not. And then there's John. John is the cosmic understanding of who Jesus Christ is. And it begins this way: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. This is Jesus Christ. Our focus must always be on him. And it is through him that we address the concerns of the world. Don't let them pull you away. Remain fast in your faith and know that God will actually see you through whatever challenges you face. It was wonderful to be with you today. God bless you and stay safe.